Slavery also resulted in discrimination against groups not thought of as part of the Eurocentric mainstream. While freed slaves were given economic opportunities, these hardly put them on equal footing with the Europeans who had profited from the practices of slavery for over 100 years. General Sherman issued a special field order in 1865, which would give newly freed slaves 40-acre plots of land to work. You have to understand that once the slaves were freed at the end of the Civil War, this created massive displacements for people that had zero economic resources. The order would allow recently freed slaves to claim 40 acres and a mule to help work the land. And this was a basic homesteading type of act. However, Southern white society and some of the capitalists in the North, as well as then President Johnson, were set against the act, and it was revoked. Even though the U.S. government broke their promises to the freed slaves, some were able to develop successful farms. However, institutionalized discrimination has taken a toll on black farmers. The USDA has the ability to protect and also offer programs such as subsidies to farmers. The USDA set up local county committees where farmers were able to discuss local issues and report back to the USDA for consideration of policies that would assist the farmers. Until 1964, no black farmer ever sat on one of these boards. The Farmers' Home Administration was created to assist farmers in getting loans so that farmers could get federal loans for housing, farm improvements, water systems, and also emergency relief. But in order to work for the FHA, one had to go to an accredited college, and many black colleges, which were often the only ones that blacks were allowed to attend, were not accredited with the U.S. Department of Education. There are still claims against the USDA asserting discrimination. In the past decade, the USDA has been charged with not filing and timely fulfilling loans for non-white farmers. The U.S. Department of Justice has not stepped in and rectified this situation to create a remedy as of this date. Historically, Asian land ownership has been undermined by the U.S. government. Recall that Asians came to the U.S. and settled on the West Coast and were instrumental in building the U.S. infrastructure, the roads, the railroads, and buildings in newly developed cities. Many settlers also became farmers on the West Coast. White landholders saw them as a great threat, and in 1921, the California State Controller John S. Chambers, the state's chief fiscal officer, publicly compared the Japanese to gophers, who seem innocent and small at first but can cause great damage. California enacted its California Alien Land Law in 1913, which put severe limitations on immigrants attempting to buy or even lease land in California. Under the act, if one was not a citizen, one could not own land, and even leasing land was restricted. In 1941, Pearl Harbor was bombed, and by 1942, 120,000 Japanese Americans, both citizens and those with legal residency, were taken into military custody solely because they were Japanese. Given the pre-war xenophobia and the concerns about Asians settling in the country, it's not surprising that Americans were so quick to distrust their loyalty. It was assumed that Japanese Americans would be sympathetic to Japan's war effort, and as a result, they were held in concentration camps, though the government labeled these as internment camps. As a result of the internment, many Japanese engaged in panic sales of their property. These resulted in belongings being sold below market value, and those who didn't sell their property were often the victims of looting or vandalism. And the state of California used the Alien Land Law to seize land owned by Japanese Americans. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848. At issue were the lands of California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and Utah, as well as parts of Colorado and Wyoming. Mexicans in the U.S. had to choose between moving back to Mexico or becoming a U.S. citizen in the next year. Many Mexicans chose to stay in the U.S., thinking that the terms of the treaty would allow them to keep their land. The treaty provided for the retention of property by those that chose to stay and become citizens, but many white Americans disagreed with those provisions of the treaty. When the U.S. Senate ratified the treaty, the land guarantee provisions were struck from the final version of the law. In order to establish who legally owned some of these lands, the U.S. created the Board of Land Commissions. However, whites could file suit to regain the lands and often had more financial resources and could win the land title back in a legal battle with the Mexican who claimed legal rights. Sometimes white officials would also demand back taxes, knowing that Mexican landowners could not afford the taxes. Often there were language barriers for the Mexican landowner, which created more difficulties in defending a lawsuit. In some cases, the Mexicans were sometimes forcibly evicted, sometimes at gunpoint, and sometimes even lynched. In addition to this, white real estate officials would find ways to prohibit Mexicans from buying back their own lands. There have been various challenges to the disenfranchisement of land that different groups have experienced over time in our country. The Japanese Americans sought reparations, which were provided in 1988 by the Civil Liberties Act. This provided $20,000 for each surviving internee, and bear in mind this would be over 40 years after the internment policies. In addition to the $20,000, an apology was officially offered from then-President Ronald Reagan. Native Americans have also made claims for the reacquisition of their lands. The Lakota Nation has sued for the reinstatement of the land in the Black Hills back to their ownership. The Black Hills is the oldest mountain range in the U.S. and is 125 miles long and 65 miles wide. Most of us know it as the place where Mount Rushmore is located. The Lakotas call these land the Pahasapa, which translates to the heart of everything that is, and consider this land sacred. The courts have formally found that the Black Hills was an improper taking and states that the remedy is to offer the Lakota Nation financial compensation. According to the Lakota Nation, the land is sacred and no amount of money paid to them for this land can be accepted. In 2012, the United Nations toured the lands and met with tribal leaders and concluded that the land should be returned to the Lakota Nation.